Bem-vindos todos à última mesa do centenário, né, da Conferência de Centenário do Paulo Freire. A gente vai ter tradução simultânea aqui, apertando o botão à direita de Interpretation. Welcome everyone to our last panel of the 100 Years of Paulo Freire Annual Conference, where it's been an honor, this whole sequence of events, and this last panel couldn't be, it's the best way to finish a table talking about the best way to finish the conference with these professors from Teachers College, most of them. So it's going to be very special. Our moderator is going to be Paulo Blickstein. He is, of course, my computer is not opening bio right now. Associate Professor of Computer Science of the Transformative Laboratory. Can someone, my computer is not failing. Sorry for that, everyone.
It's okay. I can introduce myself. Thanks, Renata. So my name is Paulo Blickstein, and I will moderate today's panel, which is the last panel of our Paulo Freire Centennial Conference. So today we're really honored to have three amazing speakers, two from Teachers College, one former Teachers College, and now a president at the Erickson Institute. So first one is Carol Benson. So Dr. Carol Benson is an associate professor of international and comparative education at Teachers College at Columbia University. She has worked in international language issues since the 1990s, and her current research is on policy developments and innovation in multilingual education for speakers of non-dominant languages. Our second panelist is Dr. Gita Steiner-Kamsi. She is a professor of education at Teachers College with focus on comparative policy studies. She also serves as the academic director of NORAG, a global network for international policies and cooperation in education based at the Graduate Institute of International Development at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. Sorry about that. It's a long name. Her research interests include comparative policy studies in education, theories and debates in international and comparative education, and methodology. And finally, we have our very own Brazilian Mariana Soto Manning. She's currently president of the Erickson Institute and a former member of a former full professor at Teachers College, Columbia University, where she was for many years. She served as the director of numerous college academic programs, including the Early Childhood Education Program, Early Childhood Special Education, and the Doctoral Program in Curriculum and Teaching. Her research interests are related to justice, equity, inclusion, and belonging in early childhood teaching and teacher education. Thank you so much, our panel. It's really an honor and a pleasure. We will start with Mariana, who will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll go to Carol and Gita, and then open for questions from the audience, and also questions from the panelists to each other. And just as a reminder, if you want the interpretation translation, it's available on Zoom. And all of those talks will be, and panels will be available on YouTube after the event, but that's not a reason for you to disconnect and go do something else, because nothing like the actual thing happening live. So you can ask questions through YouTube or through the Zoom interface. So we'll get started. So Mariana, take it away.
Thank you, Paulo, so much for your warm introduction and for including me in this amazing event. I would love to share my screen. So if whomever is the host could enable my screen sharing, we could get started. Oi, gente, é um prazer estar aqui. Eu sei que está tendo tradução simultânea, mas ao mesmo tempo queria dar as boas-vindas a todos vocês. E como brasileira nordestina, conterrânea de Paulo Freire, estou aqui realmente para falar sobre o impacto de Paulo Freire na educação infantil nos Estados Unidos. Vamos ver se eu agora consigo compartilhar. Então, a minha fala vai ser acerca de Teaching Young Children in the Pursuit of Justice, Paulo Freire and Early Education in the U.S. As many of you know, my research has taken place mostly within the context of the United States. And part of it has been deeply informed by the practices of Paulo Freire. When I did my dissertation study, I studied culture circles and really tried to codify what happened within the context of culture circles. So from thematic investigation, there was the identification of generative themes, problem posing, dialogue, problem solving, and transformative action. In terms of thematic investigation, I was really thinking about rereading what we do as teachers, as educators, what practices, assessments, materials, modes, and priorities deny belonging, and how. And I talk about belonging not as something neutral, but a political project. That belonging, who's ascribed belonging, who feels the tension between being included and excluded based on their home practices, cultural practices, as well as the performativity of belonging, which is not truly belonging, are all political. In terms of the identification of generative themes, it's really thinking about naming the sites of exclusion. What harm has been done in the name of early childhood education, or in the United States, developmentally appropriate practice? To whom? And how do we know? In terms of problem posing, problematizing exclusion, how did this come to be? Whose interest does it serve? Whose interest does it uphold? Whose interest does it marginalize and very humanity? Then dialogue, which is very different, as Freire himself put, from side-by-side monologue. It is an encounter, a transformative encounter, where we have to ask ourselves, what have I learned? How have my understandings shifted? And from that, really moving together collectively toward constructing pathways forward, toward a future that doesn't yet exist. How will we right the wrongs identified? And how will I ensure justice and belonging as rights, not as privileges, not as something nice to have, but as fundamental rights? And finally, transformative action, which can happen at the internal and emotional level, as well as the more societal and instrumental level. So really, how do I know that my actions or our actions are righting wrongs? So I don't have a lot of time today, but I want to take you to early childhood classrooms within the context of the United States, where these have taken place, where this framework inspired by Paulo Freire has taken place. So the first lessons on names. A lot of times we question kids' names, especially if their names are not conventional or normal names. Whether it is that all of a sudden in Brazil you have Tyrone, or you have Alison, or you have unconventional or unnormative spellings, or within the US. So part of that is the process that Freire engaged in terms of codification of a generative theme. The generative theme here is the exclusion based on naming. Gets codified into something. Freire used in culture circles lots of cartoons, song lyrics. Here, with young children, we have found important to employ children's books and stories that reflect to them their experience. And then inviting them to produce a counter story of their names not fitting in, not being normative, by getting them to go and interview those in their family who can shed light onto the meaning and naming conventions. So that means that then they can engage in altering from their own perspective. So here's an example. This is a book that Navea did with just the audio to text function on the phone. Lots of us have that. And it has a pattern that are commonly used words within the context of the US, really called sight words. It's Nevaeh is my name, no Nevaeh is the same. Read along to find out what my name is all about. And then at the end of the story, it's a book that every child has a page, says my name story has come to an end, turn the page and meet my friend. So she went home and interviewed her mom, and she said, my name is Nevaeh. My mommy said I was a miracle. I am from heaven. My first name is heaven spelled backwards. I'll stop there to say that the speech pathologist working with Nevaeh said, oh, I just thought that her name was strange, when in reality, it was heaven spelled backwards. So just the approach that the teacher had with Nevaeh, the speech pathologist had been influenced by her perception that Nevaeh's name did not fit the expectations. I share here Nevaeh's teacher, Miss Eileen Blanco, because she herself documented her name story and sent home to students so that the students could, in fact, engage in this learning together and really also feel some sort of more personal connection. A lot of times, especially historically marginalized students and families, they don't necessarily feel included or competent within the context of school. So it takes an extra step there. So this really follows this very culture circle that Freire put forth in a process and within the context of a kindergarten classroom, serving children with and without disabilities in the US. I do have some other examples, and I won't go into detail into them because of time, but the other one was History of Us. A lot of times children don't see, especially marginalized children, don't see themselves in the curriculum. So how is it that we engage in oral history project so that they become the subject, the center of their own social learning? Again, this really goes through this cycle in terms of family members engaging in oral history and really positioning students as subject, as central to the construction of knowledge, so that instead of seeing them as not having knowledge, they're recognized, they're honored for the knowledge and the unique contributions and stories that they themselves have. And this happened within the context of a first grade classroom, as well as within the context of second grade and kindergarten. Now we're going to preschool, and I'll conclude with the preschool example, which has to do with gender. So in one classroom, there was a preschool teacher named Dana. Dana France Bentley is a longtime collaborator of mine. And there was this time when she was cleaning up paint off the tables of 3- and 4-year-old kids. And all of a sudden they're sharing something from home, an artifact. And somebody was sharing this purple pony and telling the story of the purple pony. And somebody in her class asked, what's her name? And immediately someone else asked, another child said, why does it have to be a she? And they talked about how purple was a girl color. That was the very capturing and lifting of the generative theme of color gender association that needed to be undone within the context of that preschool classroom. So she engaged in readings of a variety of children's picture books that really had gender binaries and norms challenged. And children were able to then engage in action by reminding each other throughout the year. For example, in Star Wars play, that anyone could be, that a girl could be Luke Skywalker and take on that role, that the girl didn't have to be Princess Leia. So sometimes we think within the context of culture circles, because originally culture circles took place within the context of adult education, that you have to have a crown jewel action at the very end, when in reality, the actions of young children a lot of times are the little pebbles, pearls of wisdom that really shift everyday interactions. So with that, I am happy to engage in conversation later, but want to pass on to my colleague. My hope is that we will all recommit to upholding students' rights in the classroom, especially our youngest students, engaging young children in always interrupting injustice and pursuing justice each and every day. And Paulo Freire's framework for culture circles can really aid and serve as a powerful and hopeful framework for promoting change within the context of early childhood classrooms. Thank you. Paulo, você está no mudo.
Okay, no Zoom event can be complete without someone being on mute. So thanks so much, Mariana, for this inspirational and amazing introduction, and looking forward to the discussion later. So I think we'll now go to Carol. So take it away. Thank you, Carol.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay? I'll start. Great, thank you. So nice to be here, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation, Paulo and students, organizers. I thought I'd start, so my presentation is a little more meta level, and also I wanted to talk about how not only my relationship to Freire, but also how I've encountered him in different places, and then how I teach about Freire in one of my courses at Teachers College. But I thought it was appropriate and a little bit Freirean to talk about my relationship to him and his ideas. So I was introduced to his ideas as a graduate student at 2 universities of California. And then I actually got to hear him speak in person when he came to UCLA, and I don't remember exactly the year. Then later I was doing my dissertation fieldwork in Guinea-Bissau in West Africa, and I was observing in classrooms that were trying to use Criollo, a West African Creole, also spoken in Cabo Verde, so it was Criollo and Portuguese bilingual schools for primary level children. But I also encountered the evidence of the Freirean influenced literacy campaign that had happened at independence in the 1970s in Guinea-Bissau. And I was quite shocked that it was done in Portuguese rather than in people's home languages, because there were very few Portuguese speakers at the time. You could even argue that Criollo would have been a better language to use for beginning literacy for adults, especially since it was the language of the revolution. So I was a little bit surprised at that, and I always sort of tried to pay attention to when people talked about Freire's work in other countries. It got me questioning, why would he be a part of something that was using a colonial language? That question hasn't been answered, but maybe some of you can help me with that later. And then in, I think it was around 2003, as a technical assistant to the Ministry of Education in Guatemala, I got a chance to work on a Freire-inspired project with a team of 4 people, 2 speakers of Quiché and 2 speakers of Quechua. And what our project was to develop literacy teaching manuals for adults. And what we organized was that the team members would go to communities who spoke their languages, and they would have focus groups and kind of develop ideas about what generative themes would be useful to portray in the books. So it was a little bit bottom up to do something that was kind of top down, which was developing literacy manuals. But that was our directive from the Ministry of Education. So we tried to do the best we could in terms of how much we were listening to community members and using their ideas. So fast forward to the past few years, where I have had a chance to teach our course 4013 Literacy and International Development, that I believe was created by Leslie Bartlett, who many of you may know. And she's also a scholar of Freire. And in that course, we do 2 weeks on Freire. And I thought that I would show you some of the things that we've done. I should also say that our own Marcela Winter has helped me speak to the class because she's more of a Freirean scholar than I am. So I've been very lucky to have her as a resource person during these classes. One of the weeks, in preparation for one of the weeks of the class, everyone reads Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And what I've done with that is I'm really interested, I work in multilingual education, I support non-dominant languages and multilingualism. And so I ask everyone to read Pedagogy of the Oppressed in a language other than English. So some of our students read it in English, but I really kind of push them to look for the book in other languages. It's been translated into who knows how many languages, maybe some of you know. So I think it's pretty readily available. And so I start with that. They read the book in other languages. And then past couple of years, I've been doing an activity when they come to class, because some of the terms, the key terms in Pedagogy of the Oppressed and throughout his work, key terms and also concepts, they're not that easy to understand, and they can be really, they can link to many complex ideas. So I prepare, in the past couple of years, I prepared terms in different languages and had them discuss, get together and discuss these terms in their different languages. So for example, conscientisation, how does it translate into other languages, and what other meanings do those translations bring? Then we also look at key Freirean scholars, and we look a little bit at generative themes as well. And I have Poso there in Spanish, but I have it in Portuguese on the slide. I'll show you what we do with that. So just a couple more slides to show you how we've been. So these are some of the concepts and terms that we've played around with and discussed, coming with different languages. One of the things that has challenged me empowerment is a tricky term, and conscientisation is a tricky term. And so I was actually I went to Swedish just to see what it would bring us. And bemyndigande in Swedish means empowerment, but when you back translate it, it really means given permission or authorized. And so it brings a different angle to that term that may not be quite what Freire meant. So that's just one example of how we are able to discuss the terms and concepts by using different languages. I have an example of what one of my students, Hannah Kang, a couple of years ago found when she was looking for Pedagogy of the Oppressed written in Korean. So what she found was that actually she did not find the book in Korean, and she found an article, a newspaper article that she translated for us about someone who got in trouble for trying to sell Pedagogy of the Oppressed in Korea. And the article, part of the translation from the article is, "This book is an anti-state literature that justifies violent protests and promotes class consciousness, aimed at developing a pedagogy that raises awareness of education for critical consciousness." Yes. So, and then this person, Lee Jin-young, was arrested because he's the CEO of an ebook library called Laborers Books for violating national security law. So she said, "Oh, no wonder I couldn't find a translation of the book in Korean." So I thought you would appreciate that, the humor in that as well. Then also in the course, I didn't need to animate that, sorry. Also in the course, I tried to bring in some scholars who are very knowledgeable and who knew Freire. And this particular person is the translator of Pedagogy of the Oppressed into English. And she knew Freire very well. And I just thought that this interview with her was particularly interesting. So as you can see, I come at this, the teaching of Freire from a linguistic point of view. Also, Macedo, who's a Freirean scholar, of course, and probably you discussed him also in this conference. So we talk a little bit about him and how he linked to Freire's work. And also, I think he questioned Freire a little bit regarding the literacy campaign in Guinea-Bissau. So maybe we can take that up a little more in the question answer. Maybe some of you know more about that. And finally, I just wanted to show you what we do in class. Sorry, keep going fast. So talking about codification and then leading into a discussion of generative themes. I use this slide with some different photos of wells, and we talk a little bit about what each of these photos could bring in terms of if it represents a generative theme, how it could be discussed by a group of people and how it could lead to some kinds of inspirations or empowering ideas about what could be done. For example, I think the well on the bottom right, a lot of people notice that doesn't look like it's working. It looks like it probably dried up and it wasn't well built to begin with and not very well maintained. So that could bring about a discussion about how water is obtained in that community and what could be done, for example. So that's the international development part that I try to bring into the course. So that was all I had to share with you, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Carol. These wonderful examples and talk, and maybe in the course of this event we'll have an answer to your question about Great. And now, so last but not least, Judita, please take it away.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much, Paulo, for inviting me to say a few words. From all the speakers, I'm the least expert on Paulo Freire, but I was touched by him in 1986. I worked at the Ministry of Education in Zurich as in the research and development unit. And I was very young back then. And I thought he was like God, a God-like figure already back then. And he was a lot in Geneva because at the time his daughter was an activist, and she was an activist who stood up for the right to education for sans-papiers, we say in French, for children that came without a legal status. And at that time, children without legal papers, they were denied the right to education in Switzerland, and she stood up for that right. So he would come and visit his family, and I knew about his daughter and her great work. So I invited him as a young person, and he came. And he came, and the university was packed, and he came in sneakers. So people were like really amazed what a modest, humble, charismatic person he was, and very kind, very passionate when he would speak. So this, of course, I think really had a huge impact on me as a young person, as a young researcher, as a policy analyst. And I always, so later in my career, whenever I saw something, I was bringing it back to Freire, and I would always recognize the critical, what Mariano calls a transformative approach that he really embodied. But today I would like to speak about not Freire and his praxis and his contribution to pedagogy, but the way we talk about Freire or what he lends himself as a phenomenon. And the phenomenon is about diffusion of innovation. And it is really one of the rare cases where someone from the global south has changed the world and the global north. Usually innovation goes from the north to the south, and it goes with a lot of money, with a lot of international organizations. It sometimes goes with money attached, like that organizations or universities in the south, they adopt ideas from the north only because the grant that they get wants them to do so. So this was the Freire phenomenon is a wonderful example of diffusion of innovation. And what we discuss in comparative policy studies, scaling studies. Right now, there's an obsession with scaling of innovation. A lot of organizations talk about scaling of innovation. And the way we look at it is a concept that IDRC in Canada developed, which is not only scaling up, but also scaling deep and scaling out. And the phenomenon about Freire is he's a lawyer, actually, originally, but he didn't practice it. He never studied education, teacher education, but yet he had more influence, I would say, on teacher education than anyone else. This in itself is very interesting, actually. And in terms of scaling out, he started with alphabetization, but his impact was not just in what then became known as non-formal education, or then later on as accelerated learning, but also in classroom pedagogy, in formal settings. So this is an example of, it went deeper and deeper, his influence, but also into different, it was also scaling out. For people outside and scholars outside of education, he is also epitomizes critical theory. So even if they're not interested at all in education, but they're reading Bourdieu along with others and Gramsci and other classics in the field, and Paulo Freire is right there. So even sociologists and political scientists and anthropologists, everyone is interested in Paulo. So this in itself is an interesting phenomenon. So that this scaling deep within education, but also scaling out outside of education, and of course scaling up. And there's a whole body of research in comparative policy studies about diffusion of innovation. And actually one of my students in class, Angelo, who is also a Lehman Fellow, he says that there's a big interest in critical mass theory right now. And this is, of course, part of diffusion of innovation studies. So the question is always, what helps for innovation to spread? So we can look at Paulo Freire as an advocate, practitioner, thinker, philosopher, and we can try to understand what helped to carry his thought globally. And what we would say is that he's a boundary spanner, and his ideas went from south to north, and then south, and then global. And maybe we can discuss that. I saw in the attendance there are other diffusion of innovation scholars that are joining us. But the phenomenon, the question is, would he have had so much influence if he would have stayed in Brazil? And I think probably not. And it is probably because early on in his career, he was linked with international organizations. He worked for a couple of years when he was in exile in Chile with the UN system. And then afterwards, he was a visiting professor at Harvard. And afterwards, he was for a couple of years with the World Council of Churches. So he's like the epitome of an example of a boundary spanner who, and then he became Minister of Education much later. So he was spanning different epistemic communities or different communities from education, but then also other fields. But from politics, churches, at that time, liberation theology in Latin America. So it was politics, churches, professionalization or the profession, civil society and activism. So all these communities carried his thought globally. And he spanned also himself by traveling and by being there and by speaking different languages. And he then opened the world again, even though he was from Brazil, but when he worked for the World Council of Churches in Geneva, he worked in Guinea-Bissau and in Mozambique a lot in the colonial context. So it was at the time where the colonies and dependent countries had their own liberation movements. So he was the right person at the right time in different locations. And he's the epitome of a boundary spanner, we would say, in diffusion of innovation. He didn't stay in his own small community, but he collaborated with politics, with liberation theology, with advocacy groups, and with the profession of education, and within that, with different institutions that had an international reach, like the UN system. So Freire, and maybe the other person who also had a huge influence, is also Brazilian by coincidence, Fernando Henrique Cardoso. He had a huge influence in dependency theory, world systems theory. But if you think about it, and this is the thing that we should all be ashamed of or embarrassed about, how few scholars based in the global south make an impact on practice and theory and methods in the global north and globally. And Freire was a huge exception to this rule, actually. And the phenomenon Freire as a boundary spanner is in itself really worth analyzing in detail. So this is my little contribution to thank him, to thank this amazing person who really influenced generations of people to analyze and understand how he was able to have that reach globally with his writing and his practice. So back to you, Paulo.
Thanks, Gita. Thank you very much. We have many questions here, and including one from Guinea-Bissau, from Timor-Leste, about Carol's Guinea-Bissau question. So we'll get to that. But first, I want to ask something that is more like a provocation for the three of you. And in the first day of this event, there was a question for Gilberto Gil about, could Paulo Freire, not be from the Brazilian Northeast? Could he ever, have come from São Paulo? And Gilberto Gil was like, no way. Like the history of his life is so intimately tied to where he came from and his thought. So my question to you is, there is a lot of talk and conversation about, the decolonization of educational discourse and lots of kind of associated ideas. But given that, the US is an imperial country in a certain way, and in a way, academics in the US are sort of part of that project, do they really get decolonization? I mean, is it possible to get decolonization being in a US-based institution?
I can get started. I think that one of the things that I think that Gilberto Gil talked about is really this idea that the region of northeastern Brazil, where I'm from as well, I'm from Recife, has been the region where 40% of enslaved Africans were shipped to, and were very durable and visual and palpable structures of oppression have been and continue to be in place. And there are some similarities between, for example, the southeast of the United States and the northeast of Brazil, in terms of the perception of talking wrong, of being slow, of being lazy, of being responsible for the political ills of the country. So I think that part of these is really thinking about how do we understand that within land theft, genocide, within enslavement, chattel slavery, as well as within the context of colonization. So just because I sit right now within the context within in Chicago in an institution of higher education, it doesn't mean that this is where I'm from. Right. So Freire was the Secretary of Education in Sao Paulo. Freire was at Harvard, was in Geneva, but his roots were such that the knowledge and experience within justice with historical dispossession was very much front and center there. Likewise, he was very active within the political movement for freedom and liberation. Right now, within the context of the US, many people call that fugitivity or North Star logic. And I think that pedagogy of the oppressed in a way, and then pedagogy of freedom help us orient toward a North Star logic, a logic that moves us toward a future of freedom, a future that doesn't yet exist. So I think that it's more in terms of the fabric of who you are, your experiences, and less about the specific physical place that you inhabit at this point in time. That would be my response to your provocation, Paulo.
Carol, there is a question for you from a colleague from Timor-Leste. So do you want to take this, or shall I say something about the...
Do you want to say something about this first?
Okay. I mean, mine... Again, I'm talking about, international comparative education program and global governance, international cooperation. This is what we're doing. And actually the organizations that I'm heading, NORAD, was exactly established in 1976 as a response to giving voice to scholarship, to knowledge from the Global South. That's the purpose of NORAD. And we always say we do not do capacity building, which is a horrible word that is used. We amplify knowledge. We amplify knowledge that is there. We amplify knowledge and we disseminate knowledge from the Global South. And so this is the whole purpose of NORAD, and this is the foundation of NORAD. Interestingly, right now, there is a movement, and I believe COVID has helped to move away in international cooperation to have organizations in the global north and to strengthen it in the so-called field or in the global south. So for instance, just as an example, the US government, USAID, Samantha Power, she's actually really strong and wonderful person. She pledged right now only 6% of USAID goes to the global south. Just imagine how little that is. I mean, it is money meant for development, but in effect, a lot of work that is done for international cooperation is given to FHI 360, ECD, Chemonics, many organizations in the US, to sometimes Teachers College and universities that work in the global south. So the money really goes to northern institutions. And this is a huge problem in our field. So she pledged that USAID will raise that ratio from 6% to 25%. And believe it or not, even her predecessor had that pledge and didn't manage to raise it for all kinds of compliance issues. But this is just an example of USAID. The same, the European Union, everyone, UNICEF, the World Bank, all of them try to strengthen organizations in the global south and try to really spend the money for experts in the global south to do, that's like, it is almost like a decolonial agenda, but they will never use that word. They will not use that word, these international organizations, but in effect, it means that the resources are channeled to the south rather than kept in the north. So there is, because when you ask, can a university in the north be decolonial? My question is also, can international cooperation be decolonial? And I must say that this is actually the momentum to grasp. And I think it's more because of COVID, because nobody wants to travel. But it is a window of opportunity to make a paradigm shift and a huge shift in how international cooperation is done.
Thanks, Gita.
Can I take that one, Paulo, and then bring it to the question or the comment from Timor-Leste?
Yes, go ahead.
Thanks. So I think that the original question made me sort of go back to pedagogy of the oppressed and the way that Paulo Freire conceives of the teacher, and the fact that in literacy, at least most of the adult literacy programs that I'm aware of, you don't even call that person a teacher anymore. You call that person a facilitator, at least trying to get at that more horizontal relationship between participants in a literacy community and the person who's facilitating their understandings of literacy. And to do those things, you have to share a language. And I believe, again, I'm not a specialist in Freirean thought, but I believe that he was actually using a variety of Portuguese that was spoken in those communities that he was working with, not even a standard Brazilian Portuguese. So it baffles me why he could not sort of stick with that idea that people need to do this kind of work, the transformative work that should happen has to be done in a language that people can communicate in. So I think the participant here from Timor-Leste is saying that to his knowledge, Freire wanted the literacy campaign in Guinea-Bissau to be in Creole, but notice that Creole is not many people's mother tongue either. It was a lingua franca and a language that was widely used for the revolution, but it was not people's mother tongue or their strongest language even. And then that he continued to be a part of that literacy campaign, knowing that the revolutionary leaders or the new independent government chose to do it in the former colonial language. I just find it really unfortunate that there wasn't more said about using people's own languages for that kind of, to have that kind of communication between facilitator and participants in literacy communities.
Thanks, Carol. So I want to now ask a question that's also a provocation and even maybe more provocative from Isabel Souza, who is a Brazilian student at TC. And so she asks if we think, and I think this comes from a frustration of some South American, Latin American students that you read the question, but so she asks, do you think there is a coloniality of racialization when some scholars label Freire as white without considering the race and ethnicity relations in Brazil?
I think Brazilians need to address that issue.
But that's a little bit what I'm getting at with the languages as well, right? Because if you're using dominant languages that are former colonial languages, they're associated with white people basically, right? And people from dominant groups. And if you're using local languages, non-dominant languages, they represent people's, linguistic communities. So part of what I see as that sort of inconsistency in at least how the literacy campaigns were promoted in lots of other countries has to do with that. But I think Isa's got a really good point. that I don't have an answer to.
I think that the positionality and the subjectivity of people in Brazil get couched quite a bit more in terms of income and SES than from a racial perspective. And we do have a very incomplete picture there in terms of these narrative of racial harmony that has permeated so much of the redemocratization of Brazil. I do think that in labeling Freire white, we are having biological and specific phenotypical, perhaps, characteristics, and not really whiteness as property. I think being from the Northeast, being in political persecution, and all of that are factors that can be diminished within the context of the US without understanding that. This happens not only with Freire, but it happens with when we use pan-ethnic labels such as Latinx, and really thinking about how there are people who are more and less privileged within society according different axes of oppression. So that is all to say that I think that it's an inadequate oversimplification to simply say white. What does it mean within that context? What are some of the advantages in terms of being male, in terms of being college educated within the context of Brazil and having gone to a public institution of higher education? Those are privileges. At the same time, what are some of the disprivileges there in terms of being from the Northeast? So there are lots of complexities that I think that a simple label doesn't quite get to. And it ends up being a way of dismissing a very sophisticated work, body of work, as opposed to wrestling with some of the power dynamics that may not fit neatly within the contextualization of categories in the US.
Maybe just to add to what Mariana and Carol said, maybe it's also important to see the historical context. In the 60s, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, Freire really helped with mass education, popular education it was called at the time. And this was a project of the government. It wasn't a project of communities this is more to you also, Carol. So maybe that explains why it was always the language of the state and of the government that was used for mass education or popular education, introduction, what we would call today of compulsory schooling. Yeah. And in a post-colonial context, not decon, but post-colonial, and I mean it historically, this was an act of liberation, being able to speak the language of the master and talk back and write back. At that time, I think was very progressive to get the tools and the language of the master to articulate demands and all that. So I think in that context, the context of alphabetization or then mass schooling or popular education or compulsory education, we would call it today. I think in that type, it was a liberation, it was an empowerment to speak the language. Maybe today we are much more sophisticated in terms of language rights, minority rights, but in order to even have and articulate the rights, you need to speak the language of the master to articulate those rights.
Especially within the context of censorship, in a context where language was used as a weapon to oppress, where the written word was used as a way of diminish and demean. So yes, I think, Gita, that's definitely the case. I will also say that by and large, Brazil has adopted a colonial language as norm. So really thinking about the colonizer language, but also the language of the law, the language of dispossession, the language of censorship, again, who got to say what, the language of job contracts or lack thereof, which was very much at the center of the work of Angicos and the work of really popular education, and that really gave flight to not only pedagogy of the oppressed, but other forms of engagement, such as Augusto Boal theater of the oppressed. And I saw here that Teresa Henriques brought that up. Yes, absolutely. And I had the pleasure of working some with Julian and different folks in terms of what does it mean. I even have said that forum theater is the performative turn of culture circle. So really thinking about what does it mean not to engage in verbal language even, or written language. And that was the example that I provided in terms of oral language, of the oral language project, is a trading, like being a trader of the written language. But it does require a lot of times you becoming able to participate within the argument. And this was ever more so within a country where so many people were excluded from sites of knowledge. My own grandmother was pushed out of school and never learned how to read and write, and became a domestic worker. So when she was receiving her paycheck or whatever it was, she wasn't able to figure out, like, are they actually paying me what they said that they did, and those sorts of things. So it was very basic in terms of how do I have the language to advocate for my rights.
Thanks, Marianne. And so I want to ask a question that came from the audience to Marianne, but also to Karen and Gita, but this might be more like a native Portuguese. So, I mean, very famously, the English translation of the Pedagogy of the Oppressed missed, like, the last 3 paragraphs of the book were never translated, right? I don't know if you know what I mean, probably.
No.
But so the question for Marianne is, like, I mean, there is that, which is pretty, big, but what else is missed in translation in Paulo Freire?
A lot. In fact, I remember reading Paulo Freire when I was in normal school in Brazil, so magistério. And so that's when I read Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And then doing a doctorate in the US, people were wrestling with the ideas. So the translation is done at the word level, but it doesn't take into consideration the language structures nor the contextual factors that put those examples and those dilemmas into place. I always go back to my Pedagogy of the Oppressed in Portuguese, because not only are there missing pieces, but they're missing contextual background information, as well as historical knowledge. And within the context of English, sentences are supposed to be short and succinct. Within the context of Portuguese, there's the practice of sentences within sentences and clauses and all of that, which does not mirror the way that English works. Therefore, in a way, I feel a lot that there has been a layer, an obstacle to access, where there has been an obfuscation of the real issues and the relatability, so that this becomes located within the context of Brazil, and therefore it's a leap of faith to have to try to jump to the context of the US, whereas there are pedagogies of the oppressed happening every day in US classrooms.
Can I ask which 3 paragraphs were not translated? I'm dying to hear.
The last ones, the last.
What was it that was not? Do you know on the top of your head?
I know the last sentence, or the last few words, which are, I mean, I have to say it in Portuguese, but so the last few words is that, I mean, he's, making an argument, and the end of the very end of the book is that this will make a word which it's easier to love.
To love.
Right.
it ends up being about the humanization and love and the affective ties. And so some of that humanization is detracted from the English version because it's all about centering the oppression as opposed to centering the possibility, the love, the futurity that is present within the context of the Portuguese version, but absent from the English language version.
Very interesting.
We can actually post it here.
Yeah.
So, I mean, before going into some of the many questions we have, I think I have sort of another provocation, and it's the last one, I promise. But we have seen in recent years, fortunately, that issues of equity, social justice, institutionalized racism, and all those kinds of things have been, are much more discussed. There is a lot more action, more interest in addressing those things. But at the same time, I'm thinking about Paulo Freire and this kind of oppressor relationships and all the kind of subtle games that are played. At the same time, you're driving in a highway and you see like a billboard with a very diverse group of people advertising McDonald's or whatever, and then big huge multinational corporations talking about, oh, we have a diverse workforce, we support these education projects for Black kids. And so, I mean, what do you think Paulo Freire would say when looking at the appropriation of this by corporations, and some of those corporations are universities, do we need to be sometimes shaken up a little bit and say, well, when you start seeing this in the advertising of soft drinks, there's something wrong with the fight, right? Or
I think it's actually, the private sector or for-profit. I mean, there is also foundations that work non-for-profit, but as soon as you have for-profit, there's an economy of scale involved. And you can only have an economy of scale and sell the product or sell the service if you don't make it tailor-made, but if you have a mass product. And this is exactly the opposite, I think, of a Freirean approach to things, which the Freirean approach is getting involved in the learner's world, in the learner's reality. The whole idea of generative teams is to put the life of the learner at the center and not some global or the grammar of schooling or the script of schooling that is used at an economy of scale nowadays with digital learning globally. So the whole idea of a package, of a learning package, which is now the case that is happening with these best practices and digital learning that is spread regardless of cultural context, regardless of learners' needs globally. I think this is the antithesis of a Freirean approach. And the Freirean approaches even go so far that it is an anti-assimilation approach, rather than students having to become like the teacher, speaking the language of the teacher, thinking in the world of the teacher and the values and the middle-class values of the teacher. It is the teacher becoming like the students and understanding the world of the students and picking up the realities of the students. In earlier times in international cooperation, we would call that relevant teaching or relevant learning, and life skills or relevance. So this is exactly the opposite of how the private sector or the for-profit sector thinks, because in order for something to make profit, you have to do the same thing in many, many, many different places and scale it up, and you have to decontextualize it. And Freire is all about contextualizing learning, not decontextualizing.
Perhaps I could just add to that, because I think that's Freire actually goes even beyond that to say not only that the literacy facilitator should understand the context, but the literacy facilitator should just be one of the group, right? And that the generative themes lead to some kind of recognition of oppression by participants, and that their eyes are sort of open to the oppression that they've been experiencing, and then they together gain the tools to act on that, on their situation, to make it better, to be transformative. So I know I keep going back to the original concepts of what he was talking about in his work with adults, but I think there's a lot of, and this relates to your work, Gita, about policy borrowing and lending, even like Freirean policies and how they're interpreted in other places. And do they end up being kind of surface level, like teaching about banking or whatever, but not necessarily feeling like teachers really becoming facilitators and really being at the horizontal level, no matter if they're teaching preschool or university or people in adults in communities who are non-literate. I think those basic concepts perhaps are not as deeply understood in our world as how he would hope that they would be understood. But
I would just add to that the idea that if we understand the example that Paulo provided as an example of racial capitalism as a framework and the profiting of people of color, of bodies of color, which really have happened from 400 years ago and longer, then we can think about how their engagement in two specific characteristics. One of them has to do with exclusion via inclusion. So by including in a certain way, you're being excluded because you're being marginalized. And the other one, which we see quite a bit in schooling in Brazil, but in the US as well, is this concept or this phenomenon of obfuscation as privatization. So the privatization of education, of curriculum, of schooling ends up obfuscating some or trying to cover up some of these systems of inequity. And therefore, then it leads to, again, the profiting of private companies related to who is benefiting and who is really being oppressed by the system. So these politics, these economic politics are deeply racialized. And so we do see some terms being used very much out of context, really being robbed, being appropriated as a way of profiting and profiteering from the way that people of color a lot of times are engaging in with language, with liberatory aims.
Thanks, Mariana. So I want now, we're done with the provocations. Let's go to the questions. But because this panel is a lot about the US and like the international impact of Paulo Freire, like what do you think we can do to Paulo Freire more understood, more prevalent, more discussed in the global mood, not as the kind of token global South scholar, but really for people to engage with people and reinvent and think about it, and not just be the kind of mandatory citation in every other dissertation.
question.
I think he has become mainstreamed among people who believe in social justice. I mean, what else can you hope for? That he had such an influence, of course, not on all, but on those that believe in social justice. and those that believe in transformative learning. He's the founder of discursiveness. Foucault would say he was the founder of discursiveness on transformative learning, and it is mainstream. So it's the same. He has become so mainstream to his thinking and so influential that people even don't mention him anymore, because that's how deeply he influenced the field. So the question is, what else can we do is difficult, except being more rigorous in our own adaptation and translating it to what it means to new topics. For instance, digital learning right now. What does that mean for digital learning, which is the new normal? What does that mean? So I think that's how we can keep that spirit alive, by adapting it always to new topics that emerge. And right now, I think digital learning would be a big one.
Actually, it's quite impressive, conferences like this, and the fact that Freirean thought continues to be discussed and debated and remembered. I think it's very significant. Like Gita was saying, this person from the global South was able to influence us and continues to influence us. And the fact that we can go back to his written work, and also videos and discussions, we can continue to go back and reread and rethink. So I guess I would say that to try to get closer to his thinking, we have to continue discussing it.
And I also think that there's a little bit of a surface level understanding at times that folks cite because they expect it to be there. But I often find that when people at times critique Freire for being too theoretical, it's because they haven't really read his work, aside from potentially chapters from Pedagogy of the Oppressed, really thinking about teachers as cultural workers, letters to those who dare teach. What are some of the ways that it can impact policy, that it can impact practice? And so in a way, there has been a conflation between Pedagogy of the Oppressed and Freire, broadly. Not only that, but specific concepts that people may not even define, and they will cite Freire. So I think that there are two phenomena. There is what just talked about, but also there is the citation without reading, the reproduction of the secondary citation without really engaging with the ideas.
True. Absolutely.
Thanks. So there is a question here from Carla. So she's talking about, and I'll merge some questions, like having a child in an elementary school. I do not see Freire's pedagogy being part of the education at the public and private schools. On the contrary, children get punished if they pursue justice or if they have their own personal beliefs and initiatives. And so I want to merge into this idea that, and often when you talk about Freirean, like ideas to school districts, ministers of education, there is also always this question, like, but how does it scale, right? How can I? But if you say, if you tell the health minister, look, I found this, I invented heart surgery, and then no one would ask, well, how does it scale? It's obvious you have to build more hospitals, train more doctors, and all of that. So why you think the benefits of Freire pedagogy are not as self-evident as maybe they should? Or is it that they are so dangerous that people try to avoid it?
I'll get started with a very personal connection, which is I went to a Freirean school. a school that was a not-for-profit school that was founded by Freire and a group of other educators during the, really on the eaves of the military dictatorship. And really the idea that education changed people who can change the world. So it's not an A to B right away. And so the other thing is, in terms of transformation, what does it mean to educate people to overthrow power structures that uphold the privilege of those who are in decision-making places? So, for example, the school that I went to didn't have the moral and civics, moral e cívica, which was military content during the dictatorship. And it was a school that was founded when a group got together in 1955 and realized that the schools were being used, public schools were being used as a way of oppressing, and private schools were being used as a way of keeping elites privileged. So I think that part of it is, what is the aim of education in Brazil? What is the aim of public education? And do we really want to dismantle structures of oppression, dispossession, and dehumanization? Or do we want to socialize workers who will be filling low-level, low-pay positions to really make sure that those in power profit even more?
In comparative education, Brazil, but all of Latin America is known for, statistically, the biggest inequality in the world and the biggest amount of private schools. So that in and of itself is an issue, actually. And it's an issue that when elite starts to quit public education, there is no political will or no backup at the political level to invest in public education. And that's that phenomenon, that once the elites leave the public schools, they don't have any spokespeople in the government that invest in public education and that fight for education, because their own kids are all in private schools. And this is a huge, this mass exodus from public education of the elite especially is a huge issue. And it undermines really education as a common good. And it's a huge problem, I think, in many, many countries, and more so because there's a whole privatization movement going on. But Latin America stands out as the one continent that is really, has a huge ratio of private schools and huge inequality in the countries.
Maybe if I could just go back, I hope people are understanding that my context is international development and often a community development level. And I'm just going back to what I think Paulo's ideas are really calling for a paradigm shift. I'm sure that's part of the reason that people understand his concepts at a surface level and don't dive deeper. But just one example from low-income countries, often when there is a literacy campaign, they will not use trained primary teachers, for example, to work with adults. Why? Because they've already been trained to be top-down, banking method type of teachers. They're used to lecturing. Often they're doing it in a language that children don't understand, so there's not going to be interaction. So when there is a literacy campaign, they often choose people from communities and do the, some kind of introduction or orientation to the type of more horizontal learning that is called for a adult literacy program. But it really is a paradigm shift, and it's a paradigm shift down to communities in the global South that have limited exposure to public school, because public school still is that kind of top-down banking idea of education. So I would say that the Freire has given us so much, and he has moved the needle right on the continuum. But what his thinking really calls for is a gigantic paradigm shift that maybe human beings aren't quite capable of doing.
Thank you. So now we are getting to our final minutes. So I will, make one last question and then ask you to kind of also do your concluding remarks if you have. And again, thanks we have more than 100 people that on Zoom and more on YouTube. Thanks for all the questions. So I think today we have, a world that has, migration, climate change, a host of new problems that all point to, the more understanding, to more solidarity, to more kind of inclusion of different cultures and different questions in debates and in political decisions. And at the same time, we also have movements that go in the opposite direction of building walls, building borders, and kind of keeping people out. And it seems like in this kind of work, with this either acceptance of Freire's ideas or a very violent rejection of his ideas from some authoritarian governments, all in different countries, including in Brazil. So in that kind of context, what's the way forward in this, in this field? Is it? Do you think Freire's ideas will kind of how it will, his ideas will inform what happens next, and how we can reinvent Freire to also influence what happens next?
Maybe I can say something because I need to then sneak out. Is that okay, Paulo? Yes. So we have a whole movement right now that's about the right to education, and not just. I think in the 60s and 70s it was an issue of access. Even to access education was a big deal, and the fact that Freire, he himself worked in the rural setting to start out with, that was like already revolutionary at that time, and to enable access. But now it's the right to quality education or equitable education that is at stake, and it is endangered, it's jeopardized during COVID anyway, because of the digital divide, but also in general, because in many countries there's an introduction of, as I said, private schools, or sometimes fees for schools, sometimes hidden fees, like money that parents have to pay. So there is a whole movement, and there's this, we call it the Abidjan Principles. The Abidjan Principles, it was signed in Abidjan by many, many organizations, is all about ensuring the right to quality education for everyone. And I think this is how I would translate Freire in the year 2021. And it applies to children of displaced families, that refugee families. It applies to settings where schools charge money from parents, and that's why they don't have really quality education and all of that. So the right to education, I think, and the right to good quality education is how I, in my own work, translate Freire in my own work.
Thanks, Gita. And we know you have to leave a little bit earlier, so feel free to go. Thank you so much. Okay, so whomever wants to go first on talking about this and concluding remarks.
I was hoping that Mariana would take over on this question because I don't have much. The only thing is I would say that we can't go backwards. The world has met Paulo Freire, and we're having conferences like this, and there are Freirean scholars, and there are people practicing or trying our best to practice what we learned from him. So I don't think we should go backwards from there, but I don't know the way forward other than just continuing to talk about what these concepts mean in our current situations, whatever they are. Mariana, help me.
No, it makes me think quite a bit of the preface to the Teachers as Cultural Workers, Letters to Those Who Dare Teach, where Nita Freire, his partner, really mentioned that there was always this resistance to talk about Freirean methodology, and that it was really about problem posing. It was about changing, was about problematizing, was about developing a critical consciousness. So part of that is really thinking about taking heed on his call not to import or export a Freirean pedagogy, but to reinvent education for real change. And for that, we need to keep the compass toward freedom. We need to keep the compass toward transformation and justice, not the kind of carceral justice that seeks to identify who did it and what they deserve, but the kind of justice that repairs some of the harm that has been committed across time and space. So for that to happen, there are three key concepts that I keep as compass in terms of my own practice. One of them is humility. And he wrote that, and I would quote him, that the understanding that no one knows it all and no one is ignorant of everything. The fact that we're all learning and that we're all learners, and there's more expertise distributed in a community, no matter their level of schooling, than in any one person. The second one is the blurring between teacher and learner, because we have different life experiences. And so when we come together dialogically and ask hard questions, genuinely, we can move forward. And then the idea of praxis, of the reflection to action, dialogically and collectively mediated, so that we leave the dialogue charged and changed. So I think that it may look different, the context may look different, but at the end of the day, it's not really just about naming the injustice and becoming aware of it. It's becoming aware as well of it's becoming meta-aware. What are some of the structures that are upholding those injustices? And then honing in further in terms of becoming critical meta-aware, which is the conscientization. And a lot of times when folks translate the term, there isn't like this gradation of we have to recognize a name, we have to understand the historical temporal roots and structures, and also thinking about how do we come together to dismantle what is and move together toward what could be. So I think that for me, that really serves as a compass and really offers opportunities and possibilities for us in the future to reinvent Freire, because very key to Freire and Freire's work is the idea of the worthiness and rights of every human being, and how contextually situated and complex education is, being a political endeavor at heart.
Thank you, Mariana, Carol. So now, we're out of time, so I want to ask the students who are the organizers of this event to show up there on camera. Juliana Gomes, Marcela Winter, Renata Penalva, Isabela Souza, for you to say your goodbye. There they are. But you have to unmute.
We didn't prepare anything, so just thank you. It was an honor again, my internet is bad when I talk. But I think you have a very nice closing text for us to write, Paulo, after everybody says goodbye and thank you.
Yes. Juliana, Marcela, Isabella.
Okay, so I'll go next. I just want to say that it was an honor and a pleasure to be here with you all. And Paulo Freire vive.
I would like to say thank you so much. I am learning a lot with you guys. I have been in touch with Paulo Freire just this semester in TC. I come from the public administration field, so my first time really trying to get in touch with the educational field, and it has been a pleasure to get to know more about Paulo Freire's work, and I'm working a lot with this event. So thank you, and thank you, Paulo, for the opportunity, because I'm learning a lot.
Isa.
Okay, sorry, this is my dog. But I want to thank you, everyone. Actually, thank all the speakers. I know other speakers are also watching this panel, so thank you all for agreeing with us in making it happen. It has been a dream, not only our dream, but the dream of the other founders of the Paulo Freire Initiative here at Columbia, and especially in these times of polarization that we are facing, not only here, but across the world, especially in Brazil. Is a privilege to be in a place where you can pay homage to Paulo Freire and count on people that celebrate his work and legacy. So thank you all.
Thank you. And I just also want to thank Danilo Silva, Akio Goya, Ana Helena Melo Fernandes Dias, and Lívia Macedo for incredible help in making this happen. Also mention that this event is part of the Paulo Freire Initiative that myself and Mariana created here at Teachers College and Columbia University, and we hope to keep doing these events every year. We had support from the Institute of Latin American Studies, the Lemon Center at Columbia University. We also had, we should thank the Paulo Freire Institute, who helped us, Alexandre Schneider, and the Instituto Singularidades, who also helped us, and Teachers College, who also supported this event. And so there is a final kind of closing document that we collectively wrote, and we want to just end with that. It's just a couple of minutes. So this is signed by myself, Isabella Souza, you just heard from her, Marcela Winter, Juliana Gomes, Renata Pinalva, Danilo Silva, Akio Goya, Ana Helena Melo, and Fernanda Dias. And so this is in Portuguese, so sorry, Carol, but I think you get the translation. And
Falo português.
Okay, yeah, of course, I forgot to speak Portuguese. So, nós não fizemos esse evento porque Paulo Freire é uma estátua no Museu das Ideias. Isso não seria freiriano. Paulo Freire nos ensinou que o futuro não é inexorável, o futuro é problemático. Suas ideias são inigualáveis não pela sua certitude, mas por como elas nos expõem um mundo complexo, difícil, inacabado, mas cheio de possibilidades. Não um mundo de aceitação, mas de resistência. Não um mundo de caminhos já escolhidos, mas de possibilidades. Não um mundo de dogmas, mas de diálogo. Paulo Freire entendeu que não há uma fórmula final para a educação, a fórmula do que funciona, a resposta empírica definitiva. Não existe o melhor professor ou professora que deva ser copiado mundo afora, mesmo que pelas mais avançadas tecnologias. Não há relação dialógica possível entre estudante e algoritmo. A aprendizagem, afinal, não é só o resultado, é também processo e caminho. E o formato desse caminho comunica mais do que conteúdo. Se esse caminho não é embebido em democracia, em diálogo, em equidade, em empatia e respeito mútuo, é um caminho do nada a lugar nenhum. Paulo Freire nos ensinou, sobretudo, que a educação que dá voz ao aluno não é só um imperativo ético, ela, de fato, funciona. Quando o aluno se vê respeitado e ouvido, ele aprende mais. Quando ele aprende, mas também ensina, quando ele vê sentido, ele aprende mais. Mas isso nunca quis dizer que o professor e a professora devem renunciar ao papel de educadores, papel esse que Freire nos ensinou a admirar e valorizar. Nesse evento, tivemos de Gilberto Gil a Sérgio Vaz, tivemos de Fernando Haddad a Aciel Lumumba, de Ladson Billings a Soares, tivemos América Latina, África, os Estados Unidos, Europa, tivemos quase 4.000 inscrições para esses 5 dias, e esperávamos não só prestar uma homenagem a Paulo Freire, mas a todas as pessoas que, no Brasil e no mundo, defendem arduamente e, às vezes, colocando em risco a sua vida, o legado e o que Paulo Freire representa. É a nossa pequena contribuição a um gigante brasileiro que hoje ensina o mundo todo e nos enche de orgulho. Mas Paulo Freire também tem sido objeto de ódio. Aos que odeiam suas ideias, nossa singela recomendação: leiam Paulo Freire. Se depois de lê-lo você for contra uma educação que valoriza o aluno, faz o aprendizado relevante, empodera o estudante a construir um futuro melhor e o conscientiza das injustiças do mundo, então aí teremos uma respeitosa discordância. Mas odiar Freire sem lê-lo não pode ser respeitado. E a todos vocês, fundações, ONGs, professores, políticos, intelectuais, que têm medo de defender Paulo Freire, justamente pelo temor construído a partir da sua não leitura covarde, esperamos que entendam que é exatamente esse jogo. O ataque é tão violento quanto o oco é um castelo de cartas vazias que desmorona quando minimamente questionado. Então defendam Paulo Freire ardorosamente, apaixonadamente, tal como defendemos a Amazônia, a seleção, o samba, a bossa nova, assim como a seleção. Freire não é infalível e seu pensamento não é perfeito, mas ele tem algo que é absolutamente inestimável. Paulo Freire é brasileiro. A complexidade, a contradição, a antropofagia, o afeto e a boniteza freiriana só poderiam mesmo ter nascido no Brasil, esse país proibido de ser mais por 5 séculos, esse país inacabado, mas esse país assustadoramente complicado e infinitamente bonito. E aqui nos despedimos, temporariamente distantes desse país complicado e bonito, mas apaixonados e apaixonadas pela tarefa de propor às nossas crianças e jovens o mais importante: a insistência irrazoável no esperançar, a desconfiança de que poderes existem para serem despoderados, e a certeza de que a educação é essa busca trêmula do nosso próprio acabamento, esse que nunca chega, mas no caminho, juntos, construímos um mundo mais justo. Muito obrigado e até a próxima.